Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories, where the shadows have secrets, and the silence hides whispers of the past. Tonight, we wander among the gravestones, where restless spirits stir and forgotten tales beg to be unearthed. In this graveyard of mysteries, every cracked tombstone holds a story, and every chill you feel might just be someone or something watching from the darkness. So, light a candle, hold your breath, and prepare yourself for tales that will follow you into the night. Let's begin. Story: The Shadow in the Graveyard. There's a graveyard near a small town in Indiana, hidden at the end of a narrow dirt road. It's old, with headstones cracked and leaning, some dating back to the 1800s. Locals say it's haunted, but no one could agree on why. One story, though, keeps coming up, a story about a shadow that doesn't belong. A man named Mark told this story. He grew up in that town and worked as a delivery driver. One night, his truck broke down just a few miles from the graveyard. It was late, nearly midnight, and he didn't have a phone. He decided to cut through the cemetery as a shortcut to reach the main road and flag someone down for help. The air was cold and unusually quiet. No crickets chirped, no wind rustled the trees. Mark walked along the gravel path, his boots crunching with each step. As he moved deeper into the graveyard, he felt it. Someone was watching him. Mark glanced around. The moonlight was dim, but enough to see the outlines of the tombstones. No one was there. He shook off the feeling and kept walking, telling himself it was just his imagination. Then he saw it. A shadow, darker than the night, moved between the headstones. It wasn't shaped like a person, not exactly. It was taller, stretched unnaturally, and it didn't move like someone walking. It glided, silently, stopping behind a large tombstone. Mark froze. "Hey!" he called out, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. He felt his pulse quicken and his palms grew sweaty. He took a step forward, and the shadow peeked out from behind the tombstone, like it was watching him. Terrified, Mark turned and started walking faster. His boots slipped on the gravel as he tried to stay calm, but he could hear it now, soft footfalls behind him. He refused to look back, certain that if he did, he'd see it getting closer. When he reached the edge of the graveyard, he broke into a run, darting onto the main road. He didn't stop until he found a house with its porch light on. The family inside helped him call a tow truck, but when he mentioned the graveyard, their faces went pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" the homeowner asked. Mark nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "The shadow." The man nodded grimly. "You're not the first. It's been there as long as I can remember. No one knows what it is, but everyone knows to stay away after dark." Mark never walked through that graveyard again. In fact, he avoided the road entirely. But sometimes on quiet nights, he swears he can still feel those unseen eyes watching him. Story: The Girl in the White Dress. There's a small, forgotten graveyard in the hills of West Virginia, surrounded by thick woods. The townspeople rarely visit it, not because they don't care, but because of the stories. They say a girl in a white dress wanders the grounds, waiting for someone to help her or to follow her. This story comes from a woman named Clara, who swore it happened when she was 17. She and her friends were typical teenagers, bored and looking for a thrill. One summer night, they decided to visit the graveyard after hearing the local legend. It was past midnight when they arrived. Armed with flashlights and nervous laughter, they pushed open the rusty iron gate. The graveyard was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Fog clung to the ground like a ghostly blanket, and the air smelled damp and earthy. "All right, where's the ghost girl?" one of Clara's friends joked, shining his flashlight around. For a while, nothing happened. They wandered between the headstones, reading the faded names and dates. Some of the graves were so old, the stones were crumbling, covered in moss. Clara was starting to think the stories were just that, stories. Then she saw her. At the edge of the graveyard, near an old oak tree, stood a girl in a white dress. Her back was to them, her long hair falling past her shoulders. Clara froze, her heart pounding. "Do you see her?" she whispered to her friends. They turned their flashlights toward the figure. One of them called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The girl didn't answer. Slowly, she began to walk away, heading deeper into the woods. "We should leave," Clara said, her voice trembling. but her friends disagreed. They were curious, convinced it was a prank or someone messing with them. Against her better judgment, Clara followed as they trailed the girl into the woods. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the fog grew thicker. The girl kept walking, never turning back, her white dress glowing faintly in the dim moonlight. Suddenly, she stopped. Clara and her friends froze, standing several feet away. The girl slowly turned to face them. Her face was pale and blurred, like it wasn't fully there, but her eyes were black, empty, hollow, endless. Clara felt a wave of cold wash over her, and her knees nearly buckled. Without a word, the girl raised her hand and pointed back toward the graveyard. Then she vanished. Panic set in. Clara and her friends ran as fast as they could, crashing through the trees until they reached the graveyard. They didn't stop running until they were back at the car, panting and terrified. No one spoke on the drive home, but they all knew one thing: the stories were true. Clara never went back to that graveyard, and neither did her friends. But she still dreams about the girl sometimes, standing under the oak tree, pointing towards something Clara doesn't want to see. Story: The Gravekeeper's Warning. In a small Texas town, there's a graveyard everyone knows about, but no one talks about. It's hidden down an overgrown path, surrounded by tall oaks that block out the sun even in the daytime. Locals call it Whispering Hollow. The story I'm about to tell comes from a man named David. He's an out-of-towner who learned the hard way that some warnings are meant to be taken seriously. David had just moved to the area for work and loved to explore. One evening, he was at the local diner when he overheard two older men talking about Whispering Hollow. They said it was cursed, that people who went there at night sometimes didn't come back. David, curious and skeptical, asked about it. The men just shook their heads. "Don't go there," one of them said, "especially not after dark, and if the gravekeeper talks to you, listen to him." Intrigued, David decided to check it out. He didn't believe in ghosts, and the idea of a cursed graveyard sounded like an adventure. The next evening, just before sundown, David found the dirt road leading to Whispering Hollow. He parked his car and followed the narrow path on foot. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of his own footsteps. The graveyard wasn't very big, but it felt massive. The headstones were old and crooked, some with names so worn they couldn't be read. A rusty metal fence surrounded the grounds, and in the center was a small stone hut, likely used for tools or storage. As David wandered, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the graves. He felt a chill like they'd dropped suddenly. That's when he saw the gravekeeper. The man was tall with a weathered face and piercing eyes. He wore old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd expect from decades ago, and held a rusty lantern that flickered even though there was no wind. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. David, trying to play it cool, asked, "Why not?" The gravekeeper stepped closer, the lantern casting eerie shadows across his face. "Once the sun sets, they wake up. If you value your life, leave now." David smirked. "What are you talking about? Ghosts?" The gravekeeper didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the stone hut, disappearing inside. David stayed, laughing to himself about the man's strange warning. But as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, he felt it. The air grew heavy, and the silence was replaced by a faint rustling sound. He turned to look around. The headstones, once still and quiet, seemed wrong. Shadows stretched and moved, though there was no light to cast them. The rustling grew louder, and he swore he heard whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere. David's heart raced. He tried to brush it off, but then he saw them. Figures, dark and hazy, emerging from the graves. They moved slowly at first, their shapes shifting unnaturally. Their eyes, or what should have been eyes, glowed faintly, like embers. Panic set in. David turned to run, but the shadows were everywhere, closing in. He shouted for help, but his voice was swallowed by the whispers. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the lantern's light. The gravekeeper was standing near the gate, motioning for him to come. "Run!" the gravekeeper shouted. David didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the gate, the whispers growing louder, the shadows almost upon him. As he crossed the threshold, he felt a sharp tug on his shirt, but he didn't stop. He kept running until he reached his car and sped away. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the graveyard was gone. The road was empty, as if it had never been there. David never went back to Whispering Hollow. And when he asked the locals about the gravekeeper, they just stared at him. "There hasn't been a gravekeeper there in over 50 years, one woman said. "The last one disappeared, just like the others." Story: The Laughing Grave. In a rural village in Louisiana, there's an old family cemetery tucked behind a bayou. It's surrounded by thick willow trees, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers even when there's no breeze. Locals call it the Laughing Graveyard, but no one laughs when they talk about it. The story comes from a young man named Eric. He and his cousins grew up hearing about the cemetery's strange reputation. The legend was simple but chilling. If you visited the graveyard at night and stayed long enough, you'd hear laughter. Not cheerful laughter, but low, guttural, and wrong, like something laughing at you, not with you. One summer, Eric and his cousins, fueled by boredom and teenage bravado, decided to test the legend. They grabbed flashlights and snacks and rode their bikes to the graveyard just after sunset. The air was thick and humid, and the sounds of frogs and crickets filled the night. When they arrived, they found the gate hanging off its hinges. The graveyard was small, overgrown with weeds, and most of the headstones were crumbling or crooked. Some had strange carvings on them, symbols Eric didn't recognize. "All right," one of his cousins said. "We're staying until we hear it. No chickening out." They settled near the center of the cemetery, sitting on the ground in a circle. At first it felt like a joke. They laughed and told ghost stories, teasing each other about getting scared. But as the hours passed, the mood shifted. The crickets and frogs stopped. The air grew heavy, and the only sound was their own breathing. Eric checked his watch. It was just after midnight. That's when they heard it. At first, it was faint, like a distant chuckle carried on the wind. They froze, their flashlights scanning the dark. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. The laughter came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from one direction. It surrounded them, echoing off the headstones. It was deep, raspy, and unnatural, like a voice that hadn't spoken in centuries. "Okay, very funny. Who's messing with us?" another cousin said, his voice shaking. No one admitted to anything. The laughter grew louder, closer, as if whatever was laughing was circling them. The boys huddled together, their flashlights trembling in their hands. Then, one of the headstones toppled over with a loud crash. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so intense it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Eric's flashlight flickered, and in its dim glow, he saw movement. Shadows shifting between the trees and graves, but there was nothing casting them. The air felt icy, and a foul smell, like rotting meat, filled their noses. "We need to go," Eric said, his voice barely a whisper. They grabbed their stuff and ran, but as they reached the gate, the laughter returned, louder, mocking, and filled with malice. One cousin looked back and screamed. "What? What did you see?" Eric shouted as they pedaled away on their bikes. The cousin wouldn't answer until they were far from the graveyard. Finally, he whispered, there was something standing by the graves, tall, with glowing red eyes, and it was smiling. The boys never went back to the Laughing Graveyard. Years later, Eric heard that another group of kids had tried to spend the night there. They weren't so lucky. They were found the next morning, sitting in the cemetery, eyes wide open, their faces frozen in silent screams. And the laughter? It hasn't stopped. Story: The Bells of the Forgotten Church. The cousin wouldn't answer until they were far from the graveyard. Finally, he whispered, there was something standing by the graves, tall, with glowing red eyes, and it was smiling. The boys never went back to the Laughing Graveyard. Years later, Eric heard that another group of kids had tried to spend the night there. They weren't so lucky. They were found the next morning, sitting in the cemetery, eyes wide open, their faces frozen in silent screams. And the laughter? It hasn't stopped. "Abby, get down here!" her friend yelled. She didn't need to be told twice. She bolted down the staircase, nearly tripping in her panic. As the three of them ran out of the church, the bell rang again and again, each chime echoing louder, faster, and more frantic. When they reached the edge of the graveyard, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. They turned back to look at the church. In the broken window of the bell tower, they saw a figure, a shadowy shape with glowing eyes. It stood still, watching them, as the faint sound of the bell began to ring once more. The three of them didn't stop running until they reached their car. Abby later learned that several hikers had gone missing in the area near the church over the years. Locals believe the bell rings to lure people inside, and once it does, the shadows in the tower take them. Abby has no plans to go hiking in those mountains again. And every time she hears church bells, even in broad daylight, she feels a chill run down her spine. Story: The Gravedigger's Lantern. In a quiet town in Pennsylvania, there's an old cemetery known as Stillwater Rest. The cemetery is small, tucked into the woods at the edge of town, with graves dating back to the Revolutionary War. It's a peaceful place during the day, but at night, locals avoid it. They all know the legend of the Gravedigger's Lantern. The story begins with Henry Cotter, a gravedigger who worked at Stillwater Rest in the early 1900s. Henry was known for his dedication to his work. Rain or shine, day or night, he could always be seen with his lantern, digging graves and tending to the grounds. But one stormy night, Henry disappeared. When the storm cleared, townsfolk found Henry's lantern glowing softly at the edge of a freshly dug grave. His shovel was there, the grave was finished, but Henry was gone. No body, no footprints, just his tools and the glowing lantern. They buried the lantern in the grave Henry had dug, assuming it was a tribute to his work. But ever since, people claim to see a light moving through the cemetery at night. Some say it's Henry's spirit, still tending to the graves. Others say it's something darker. This is what happened to Lisa, a high school teacher new to the area. One fall evening, she was driving home from work when her car broke down near Stillwater Rest. With no cell service and the sun quickly setting, she decided to cut through the cemetery to reach a nearby house she'd seen on her way in. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. The trees were bare, their twisted branches casting long shadows in the fading light. Lisa hurried along the narrow gravel path, trying to shake the eerie feeling. As she walked, a soft glow caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a flashlight, someone else in the cemetery. But as she got closer, she realized it wasn't a flashlight. It was an old lantern, its flame flickering unnaturally, floating several feet off the ground. Lisa froze, her heart racing. The lantern moved slowly, weaving between the graves as if it were being carried. She called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The lantern stopped. Then it began to move toward her. Panic set in. Lisa turned and walked faster, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. But the lantern's glow grew brighter, and she could hear the faint sound of shoveling, metal scraping against earth. She broke into a run, but the light followed, illuminating the path in front of her. Suddenly she tripped over something, a half-buried gravestone, hidden in the tall grass. As she scrambled to her feet, she saw the lantern hovering just a few feet away. And behind it, a figure emerged. It was tall and shadowy, its face obscured by the glow of the lantern. But its hand, gnarled, skeletal fingers, reached out toward her. Lisa screamed and bolted, running faster than she thought possible. She didn't stop until she reached the house at the edge of the woods. The family inside helped her call for a tow truck, but when she mentioned the lantern, their faces turned pale. "You saw him, didn't you?" the homeowner asked. Lisa nodded, still trembling. "Don't ever go near that cemetery after dark. Henry doesn't like visitors." Lisa never drove that road again, but every so often, late at night, she dreams of a flickering lantern and the sound of a shovel scraping against the earth. Story: The Crying Widow's Grave. In the heart of Tennessee, there's an old cemetery surrounded by wildflowers and dense woods. At its center lies the largest gravestone, weathered but still standing tall. Locals call it the Widow's Grave. The story goes that in the late 1800s, a woman named Margaret lost her husband, William, to a sudden illness. Devastated, she spent every day at his grave, weeping and begging for him to return. Neighbors said her cries could be heard echoing through the valley, even at night. One stormy evening, Margaret disappeared. When the storm cleared, her neighbors found her scarf near William's grave, soaked and torn. No one ever saw her again. After her disappearance, people began to hear strange noises near the cemetery at night. Soft crying, whispers, and footsteps on the gravel paths. Over time, they started calling it the Crying Widow's Grave. This story comes from a man named Josh, who swears it happened to him. He and his wife, Laura, moved into a house not far from the cemetery. They didn't believe in ghost stories and thought the legend was just local folklore. One evening, while walking their dog, they found themselves near the cemetery as the sun was setting. The gate was rusted, creaking in the wind, but the flowers growing around it made the place feel peaceful. Curious, they decided to take a look. The cemetery was quiet, almost too quiet. As they wandered through the graves, reading the names and dates, Josh noticed something odd. Every headstone was covered in moss or dirt, except one. The widow's grave stood clean, untouched by time, as if someone had just polished it. Laura pointed to the inscription, Margaret and William Carter, together forever. That's sweet, Laura said, but Josh felt uneasy. There was something about the air around the grave. It was colder, heavier. As they turned to leave, the dog froze, growling low and deep. Its fur stood on end, and it refused to move. Josh and Laura looked around, but there was nothing there. Then they heard it, a faint sobbing sound, so soft they almost missed it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Laura grabbed Josh's arm. "Let's go," she whispered. They hurried back to the gate, the dog dragging them forward, but as they reached it, the sobbing grew louder. It wasn't just crying, it was a voice, pleading. "Don't leave me. Please, don't leave me." Josh looked back, and his blood ran cold. Near the widow's grave stood a figure, a woman in a black dress, her face hidden by a dark veil. She stood perfectly still, her head bowed. "Go!" Laura shouted, pulling him through the gate. They ran back to their house without looking back. Once inside, they locked the doors and closed the curtains, their hearts pounding. Later that night, as they tried to calm down, they heard something outside, a soft knock on the front door. Josh looked through the peephole. No one was there. But on the porch, he saw a single wildflower, freshly picked, lying on the ground. The next morning, they returned to the cemetery out of morbid curiosity. The widow's grave was covered in wildflowers, arranged neatly around the base of the stone. Josh and Laura moved away a few months later, but to this day they both avoid cemeteries at night. And every once in a while, when the house is quiet, Josh swears he can still hear that soft, heartbroken voice. "Don't leave me." As you turn off the lights and try to sleep tonight, keep one thing in mind. Some stories aren't just told, they're lived. And if you hear a creak, a whisper, or a faint cry, don't look back. You never know who or what might be watching. Thank you for joining us here at Creepy Corner Stories. Stay curious, stay cautious, and until next time, sleep well if you can.